Good morning.
Morning, Jamie. Morning, Jamie.
I remember when we first came to the church, it was a couple of years after my parents had come to the faith, and I wasn't the best kid. We weren't raised in a Christian home, and by the time my parents converted and came to the Lord, my brother and I, well, at least for myself, I was a young teenager, and our habits and our character was basically formed when we were younger, and so we had some troubling years. At least I did. I think my brother's a little better than myself. So Mom thought, I'm going to send you to military school or to Great Lakes, Christian private school. And so Great Lakes it was. So I went there for a year. I wasn't that bad of a kid. I was quiet, minded my own business. I was kind of your skateboarder, but I wasn't really trying to be friends with the good Christian kids. That wasn't my crowd. And so I gravitated to others. But I did notice there was a number of others there that were from Hong Kong. We had some international students. And I found real interest in the language and some of their culture. And so I became friends with them. And I earned the nickname Dragon. And I thought, that's cool. So I went by Dragon. And I thought that was the greatest thing, and when I saw them, they'd say, Dragon. I said, hey, guys, and I felt great. I'd sit with them through chapel talks and stuff like that. And then one day, I asked them, how did I get the name Dragon? What did you see in me? Because, you see me as, a valiant hero, someone who just stands up against evil. No, it was one morning in chapel when you were sitting beside us, and you had really bad breath, and we called it dragon breath. And I said, that's not what I was thinking. I don't want that name anymore, right? We get these nicknames sometimes, and maybe you've gotten nicknames, and these are nicknames as kids, and then you find out where it comes. You don't want that nickname. It's not a good nickname. You envision something different. Maybe you see your identity, maybe you're watching people on TV, and you're like, or on a show, and you're like, that's what I want to turn out like. When you're young, you try and you find your identity. Well, talking about names and talking about identity, my name that was given to me at that time was Dragon, but my name that was given to me at birth, and some of you know this, was David. And my dad was also Dave. So my mom said, let's go by his middle name, James, which I found out James comes from Jacob, which is interesting. So then we got, because my brother was Gordon, they went by Jamie and Gordy. And so my brother doesn't like Gordy, so if you want to bug him, you just call him Gordy. So I kept Jamie, which makes a real mess, for all the different things. That's James, David, Jamie, banking and everything. It's going to be a nightmare in the future for my family when I pass, unless I sort it out before then. But I'm not the only one who had a name change or was given a nickname. There's many people in the Bible whose names were changed, and one in particular is Peter. And so you'll know that Peter's birth name was Simon. And that comes from the Hebrew or Aramaic, he has heard. And Jesus gave him the name Cephas. Now Cephas is Aramaic. That's probably what he went by, was Cephas or Simon, one of those two. But we call him Peter, because Cephas, when it's translated to the Greek, is Peter. And so it means the same as Cephas, which is rock or stone. But when you look at the life of Peter, he's anything but a rock or a stone. And I want you to remind you, for those of you who aren't familiar with Peter, Peter was one of the 12 that Jesus called to follow him. And by the way, we're starting a new series, Lessons on Discipleship from the 12. So we're going to start with Peter. He was the most famous, most well-known. Now, Peter was not stable like a rock. Here's Peter, and Jesus, when he meets them, Peter's out fishing, and Jesus is on the beach teaching, and Jesus, when he's done teaching, he says, Peter had fished all night, and he says, cast your nets on the other side. And Peter's thinking probably, I'm the fisherman. We just fished all night. What are you thinking? There's not going to be fish on the other side. But he does it. And when they cast their nets, they haul in so much fish, the boats can't even float right. They're starting to sink. So they haul in all this fish, and Peter falls down before Jesus and says, it seems like he's so humble. Away from me, Lord. I'm a sinful man. And so here's this really great attitude. He recognizes who he is before the Lord, and he's humbly bowing. But then a short time later, when he's following Jesus, and Jesus says, you will all fall away on account of me. But after I've risen, I will go ahead of you to Galilee. Peter told him, verse 33, no. Even if everyone falls away because you, I never will. Truly I tell you, Jesus said, tonight before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter was like, no way. That's not happening. I know it. Even if I have to die with you, Peter said, I will never deny you. That's not going to happen. Now, he's just been with Jesus for 3 years. You'd think by now you would trust what Jesus says, that Jesus knows better than you. But this isn't the first time that, Peter has this difference of opinion with Jesus. So here's humble Peter, and then here's this confident Peter. Maybe a little bit of overconfidence, perhaps. And then we see fearful Peter. Because a little bit later, as the rooster crowed, Peter remembered the words that Jesus had spoken, that you will deny me 3 times. He went outside and wept bitterly because he denied Jesus. So here's humility, confidence or overconfidence, to fear. You'd think he'd stand up, but he's human. He's got this fear. And then when he's on the mountain, before this happened, go back a little bit, there's Jesus talking to Moses and Elijah. And Jesus is transfigured. He's glowing. And Peter, he just has to speak. He doesn't like silence. It seems like, you ever have a conversation? Bianca will say this. I just, I don't like silence. I just kind of make some conversation. Well, it seems like Peter was doing this thing on the mountain. Because Peter sees this happen. He's like, Lord, should we make 3 shelters, 3 tents? And Mark and Luke both tell us that he did not know what he was saying. He was terrified. He just had to say something. He didn't even know what he was saying. So here's Peter again, trying to make something up like, this is great for us to be here. Let's set some tents up and stay. You don't know what you're talking about. And a voice interrupted him. This is my son. In other words, Peter, God is using this to teach something. So maybe he's a little impulsive. Just have to say something. Peter's also the one who struck the high priest and cut off his ear, trying to defend Jesus and, trying to be the one to take the initiative. Impulsive. Peter also at one time tried to correct Jesus. From then on, Jesus began to point out to his disciples that it was necessary for him to go to Jerusalem and suffer many things. Again, this is before he denied him. And it says in verse 22, Peter took him aside to rebuke him. Oh no, Lord, this will never happen to you. You got it wrong, Jesus. We're not going to let that happen. And Jesus, he knew it had to happen because that's his mission. And so, Jesus, get behind me, Satan. Like, no, I'm not going to let you defend me. This is one of those things that has to happen. So Peter, again, thinking he knew best, thinking that it would never happen, he would never allow it. Perhaps that's what's going through his mind. Again, thinking maybe he knows more about Jesus. So we have overconfidence, impulsive, rash, and Peter was unpredictable. Peter's also the one that when they're on the boat and there's this storm and Jesus is walking on the water and it says that he's going to walk past them. Do you remember that account? And they're terrified. They think it's a ghost. And Jesus said, calm down, it's just me. Lord, if it's you, Peter said, command me to come out on the water to you. He asked if he could come and walk on the water. Now, there's a little bit of unpredictability. What's he going to ask next? What is it? None of the other guys even thought of that. So you never know maybe what he's going to do, what he's going to say, or what he's going to ask. And so Jesus said, come. And climbing out of the boat, he started walking on the water. And you can imagine how the others looked at Peter and how he must have felt. But then he looks around and he sees the winds and the storm and he begins to sink. And he cries out, "Lord, save me." Here's this confident Peter, "Lord, if it's you, tell me to walk on the water." And he walks on the water, and the next thing you know, he's, "Help, help, what have I gotten into?" So this doesn't seem like characteristics of a rock. We don't see these characteristics of someone who's a rock. We see overconfidence, fear, we see impulsiveness, rash, and someone who's unpredictable. And yet, Jesus never gave up on him. As a matter of fact, Jesus knew all this before he called him. He specifically went out there. He knew what Peter was like, and he called Peter as one of his 12. And you think, wow, I don't think he's maybe ready yet, Jesus. Do you know what you're getting into? Why don't you fast forward a few years and come a few years later? Why did you come when he was like that? Why don't you wait till his character matures a bit? No, Jesus knew that he was going to mature and prepare and grow Peter's faith. So how did Jesus do this? Well, Jesus didn't just teach Peter. He did teach him. He tolerated him. He corrected him. He prayed for him. And he entrusted him. And I say that to say, our mission in the church is to go and make disciples. And our mission in the church is to make disciples who will make disciples. You're not just saying, "Hey, you need to be a disciple. Great, check, done. You're a disciple, I did my job." No, we are to make disciples. In other words, we're passing the torch on. And they need to learn to pass the torch on. And they need to learn to pass the torch on. This is an ongoing mission. And that's what our work's about. And so how did Jesus do it? Well, let's take a look. When Peter said, "Lord, command me to come out to you on the water," he begins to walk. He says, "Lord, save me." Jesus didn't say, "I'm sorry, you chose that. I'll save you and send you back. You're done now." No, Jesus reached out and he rescued him. He bailed him out. You got yourself into trouble, you figure it out. Guys, send him a life preserver. I'm out of here. He didn't do that. He reached down and lifted him up. He rescued him, knowing that this would be a lesson that Peter would remember. Jesus corrected. "Get behind me, Satan." Jesus corrected Peter. He probably explained some of it to Peter about, this had to happen. He knows best. We're not sure exactly what was all said after this, but we know that Jesus did rebuke and correct. But Jesus also encouraged. When Peter doesn't know what to say, let's put up 3 shelters. We read that they were terrified. They hear this voice, verse 5. "This is my son, whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell face down and were terrified. But Jesus came up and touched them, a gentle touch. "Get up. Don't be afraid." He was there to encourage them. And we know that when Jesus said, "Tonight, all of you will fall away because of me," no, that'll never happen. "Simon, Simon, look out. Satan has asked to sift you like wheat, but I have prayed for you." Jesus corrected, encouraged, he rescued, and he prayed. Are these things that we're doing when we make disciples and we're trying to encourage and mentor and raise up the next generation? Are we encouraging? Are we correcting? Are we rescuing? And are we praying? Prayer, the most important thing that we should be doing as we try and raise up new disciples. And finally, Jesus restored. And some of you will remember this. So, Peter's greatest challenge was after he denied Jesus 3 times. He failed them. And Jesus didn't just choose Peter. Peter was one of the closest ones. It's called the inner circle. 3 of those 12 were with Jesus. Only 3 of them came for certain events. And Peter was always one of those 3. He was always there. We call that the inner circle. And there's one of Jesus' closest companions saying, I'll never deny you. And he denies him 3 times. And so when Jesus rose from the dead, and when Jesus met them out on the shore of the Sea of Galilee sometime later, this is what Jesus said. It might be a little bit hard to read. But Jesus asked, Peter, Simon, he calls him. It's interesting, Simon as opposed to Rock, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said, you know that I love you. Feed my lambs. A second time he asked him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Shepherd my sheep, he told him. And he asked him a third time, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was grieved that he asked him a third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Feed my sheep, Jesus said. You see, and I've said this before, we remember when Peter was given the keys. Peter was given this great responsibility. On this rock I build my church and I give you the keys. Jesus didn't say, Peter, you really messed up and I'm going to have to, give those keys over to John or one of the other guys. Jesus gave him another chance. Jesus gave him the opportunity to change. Sometimes that's difficult for us to do. When someone really messes up, especially even with our own kids, it's like, well, you're never allowed to do that ever again. Well, how will they ever have another opportunity to prove that they've changed if we never allow that? And so, patience, prayer, encouragement, and restoration. Trying to encourage them and trust them and give them a second chance. All important characteristics that we should model when we're raising up and making disciples who make disciples. Leadership is not easy, but Jesus saw something when he gave him the name Peter that no one else saw. You see, Jesus saw who Peter was, who Peter would become. He called him Rock because Jesus knew that he would become a stable rock. He knew that through all these things that Peter had going on, that Jesus could change him, help him to focus, help him to use some of his challenges and to direct them to become his weaknesses to become strengths. And so years later, we see Peter the rock, Peter the shepherd, who is called a pillar in the church in Jerusalem. Pillar being a foundation, something that doesn't move, something that holds up like a rock. Peter is called a pillar in the church, and he's writing years later, as he writes the letters that we have in our Bible, 1st and 2nd Peter. And we read Peter as he writes about really the end time. In his second letter, he writes this little thought about the afterlife. And as we had this for our reading this morning, somebody probably said, oh, wow, this is really interesting. What's the end going to be like? Some people thinking about the end, everything will be destroyed by fire. First time was a flood, and we're seeing, what does this mean, and what's it going to look like, and is the end coming? There's a lot of questions we have about that. People back then also had these questions. So Peter's addressing this. Some people are saying, Jesus, we're told he's coming, but he's not coming. But Peter says, the Lord did not delay his promise, as some understand delay, but is patient with you, not wanting any of you to perish, but to come to repentance. The day of the Lord will come like a thief, and he goes on and describes it. And then I want you to notice later on what he says. Therefore, dear friends, while you wait for these things, make every effort to be found without spot or blameless in his sight, at peace, also regard the patience of our Lord as salvation. I want you to notice that twice he talks about patience. And if you look through the letter, that Peter, who was maybe overconfident and impulsive and all those things, you see a different character as he's now an elder and a shepherd. As he's proven his character and he's been able to be humble. He's been able to accept when what God knows is right. And he's been able to look back and to see God's immense patience with him. And so, I guess the question is, for us, are we following the example that Jesus left us with one another? Are we being patient? Are we seeing the potential in people? Or do we give up too quickly? The Bible tells us, talks about raising up new leaders, talks about making disciples and equipping them. It gives us examples of bringing others along, of being someone that they can imitate. And yet, when we try and do that, that's not always easy. It's very easy to quickly judge and to quickly, quickly look at the failures of people and say, you know what, that's good enough, I'm going to move on. The difficult thing is to see in others what Jesus sees in us. To remember that we too made mistakes, and that's how you grow. And to be patient and encouraging, to be prayerful, and to have the insight that God has as we try and raise up others to follow in the footsteps of Jesus. Someone once said, imagine hiring a young apprentice carpenter. In the first week, he measures wrong. He cuts boards too short. He bends nails. And he wastes a lot of materials. No one would conclude he'll never be a carpenter. And I think about that as we think about those who have been patient with us and all the things and all the challenges that we've maybe made for them. And just as much as we can think of, try and imagine how patient God has been with us and how much time and how much damage we've done sometimes to the mission. But God is patient with us and he has not given up on us. We are not doing this alone. Just as Jesus gave Peter another name, God was there directing Peter, and God is here directing us. God sees in us a different name. And one day we'll get that new name and we'll know what it is. For now, may God bless us as we try and remember that we've been called to make disciples. And just as Peter was called, we're willing to step out. We're willing to develop whatever gifts we've been given. And we're also patient with those, trying to help them develop their gifts as we remember our mission to go into all the world, preach the good news to all creation. Let's stand for our final hymn.